I still remember the exact moment my life cracked open. It wasn't some dramatic movie scene, no thunderstorm, no screaming match, just a quiet dinner on a Friday night. My father cut into his steak and without even looking up said, "Samantha, we're done paying your bills. You're an adult now. It's time to grow up." The words hit me harder than I expected. Across the table, my mom sipped her wine, eyes glued to her phone, pretending she hadn't heard him. But she had. She always heard everything. For a second, I thought it was a joke. I laughed nervously and said, "You mean, you're cutting me off for real?" My dad looked up, finally meeting my eyes cold, detached, like I was some stranger. "For real," he said, "we've carried you long enough. You chose art school. You chose to chase dreams instead of a career. We warned you." I swallowed hard, my chest tightened. I could feel my throat burning. "Dad," I whispered, "I'm still trying. You know how hard it is to make money starting out. I just need a little more time." He sighed, wiping his mouth with his napkin. "Time's up, Samantha. You're 24. When I was your age, I was already paying my own mortgage." And then my mom finally chimed in, her voice smooth, sugar-coated, but with that edge that always made me feel small. "You've been ungrateful for too long. We can't keep supporting your fantasy. You need to face reality. Fantasy." That word stung. Painting had never been a fantasy for me. It was survival. It was the only thing that kept me sane. I looked at them both, trying to find even a flicker of love in their faces, and saw nothing but disappointment. The air was heavy. The food on my plate was untouched. That night, I went to my room and cried until my pillow was soaked. I didn't cry because they cut me off. I cried because it was finally clear. They had given up on me. I packed my bags quietly before dawn. As I walked through the hallway, I stopped by their bedroom door. I almost knocked, almost said goodbye. But what was the point? They wouldn't have cared. When I reached the front door, my mom's voice floated from the kitchen, calm as ever. "You're leaving?" she asked, not looking up from her coffee. I hesitated. "You said you were done supporting me, remember?" She shrugged. "Just don't call us asking for help. We're done." Her words sliced through me like ice. I turned and walked out, clutching my single suitcase, the one I'd had since college, and whispered to myself, "I'll make it, even if it kills me." Chicago felt like a different world when you're broke. I rented the tiniest studio apartment I could find, cracked walls, leaky pipes, a radiator that screamed every night. The rent was $750. My bank account had $400. I sold old sketches on Etsy. I painted portraits for people online. I ate instant noodles and drank tap water for weeks. Some nights, I stared at my ceiling and thought about giving up, not on art, but on life itself. But every time I remembered my dad's voice, fantasy. That single word kept me painting. Out of spite, out of rage, out of something that felt like revenge. Then one day something changed. I posted a portrait on Instagram, a woman with tired eyes and smeared lipstick, titled "I'm Still Here." It got shared, then reshared, then it went viral. A week later, a gallery owner from New York, Elise Chapman, sent me a message. She said she saw something raw and painful in my art, something real. She asked if I had a collection. I lied, of course I didn't, but I told her I did, and that I'd send it within a month. I worked nonstop for 26 days. My hands blistered, my nails were black with paint. I slept 3 hours a night and lived on coffee. When I finally shipped the paintings, I collapsed on the floor and slept for almost a full day. 2 weeks later, she called. Her exact words were, "Samantha, people cried when they saw your work." I froze. She offered to host an exhibition for me in New York City. I borrowed money for a bus ticket, wore the only decent dress I owned, and walked into that gallery shaking like a leaf. People actually came. They stood in front of my paintings, whispering, nodding, some even crying. It felt like a dream. By the end of the night, every single piece was sold. My first real paycheck, $92,000. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and sobbed into my hands. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't a fantasy. I was an artist. Fast forward 2 years. I had my own studio, clients from Europe, and 2 solo exhibitions under my name. I wasn't rich, not yet, but I was free. And then the call came. It was my mother, she sounded. Different. Her voice was small, hesitant. "Sweetheart," she said, "your dad and I are in a bit of trouble. The house. We're behind on payments. We might lose it. I stayed silent. My heart pounded. It was surreal, the same woman who told me never to call, now asking me for help. She continued, if we could just get a loan, maybe 20,000, we could save it. Please, Samantha, 20,000. That was nothing to me now, but something in me, pride, hurt, maybe both, held me back. I'll think about it, I said quietly and hung up. That night, I looked up the house's address online. To my shock, it was listed for sale. Foreclosure, the same house I grew up in, the same walls that heard them call me a disappointment. And then, I made a decision that changed everything. I called my real estate lawyer. Within 48 hours, I bought the property. Cash, no mortgage, no hesitation. When the paperwork arrived, I stared at my name on the deed. Owner, Samantha Reeves. I can't describe the feeling. It wasn't revenge, exactly it was. Closure. A week later, I drove down that same street for the first time in years. The trees were taller, the paint on the house more faded, but everything else looked the same, even the flower pots my mom used to love. My parents were sitting on the porch when I pulled up. My dad squinted. Samantha, what are you doing here? I smiled, just wanted to check on you. My mom looked nervous. We sold the house, she said quickly. New owners moving in next week. I know, I said, handing her an envelope. She opened it and froze. It was the ownership document. My name was printed in bold. You bought it. My dad whispered. I nodded. I did. I thought it'd be poetic. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. My mom's lips trembled. My dad's eyes went glassy. I looked at them both and said softly, don't worry. You can stay here for now, but I wanted you to see dreamers make it too. Then I turned, walked back to my car, and drove away. For the first time in years, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry, just free. When I drove away that day, leaving my parents on the porch, I thought that was at the end of my story. But the truth is, endings are never clean. They ripple, they echo, they haunt. For a few weeks, I felt an unfamiliar peace. I went back to my Chicago studio, painted for hours, lost myself in colors and silence. People were calling me the prodigy who painted her pain into beauty. Every interview wanted the same thing, the story. What inspired your breakthrough? I always smiled and said, life did. But behind that calm smile, there was still something unhealed. You can buy a house, build a career, even rewrite your past, but you can't buy forgiveness. One evening, I got an email, subject line, from Mom. My heart stopped. The message was short. Your father isn't well. He had a mild stroke. He's recovering, but we need to talk. For 2 days, I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't trust myself to. But on the 3rd day, I packed a small bag and drove back. When I arrived, the house looked the same, except this time it didn't feel like theirs, it felt like mine. And maybe that was what scared me most. Mom opened the door. Her face looked tired, older. The confidence she once wore like armor was gone. Samantha, she whispered, you came. I nodded. The living room smelled of coffee and old memories. Dad was sitting in an armchair, pale, a blanket over his legs. When he saw me, his eyes softened. For a moment, he looked like a stranger. Then, in a weak voice, he said, you look successful. It wasn't an apology. But it was close enough to make my throat ache. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Mom spoke. I know we weren't kind to you, she said quietly. We thought we were teaching you responsibility, but we only taught you distance. I looked down at my hands. Paint still lingered under my nails no matter how much I scrubbed. It never went away. Maybe that was fitting. The past doesn't wash off. She continued. You didn't deserve the way we treated you, especially me. I was cruel. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I was jealous, I think. You had dreams. I'd given mine up long ago. I didn't know what to say. There were 1,000 things I'd imagined, telling them 1,000 ways I pictured this conversation going, but in that moment, I just whispered, I know. My dad reached out, his hand trembling. I'm proud of you, kid, he said, voice cracking, even if I never said it. That was it. The dam inside me broke. All those years of anger, all the sleepless nights, the tears, the drive to prove them wrong, they melted away in a single moment. I stood up, walked to him and hugged him. He smelled of old cologne and hospital soap. He whispered, I'm sorry. I whispered back, I know. After that day, I didn't move them out. I let them stay in the house. It wasn't pity, it was peace. They started taking care of the garden again. My mom even began painting small watercolors in her free time. One afternoon, I walked past her studio. She was sitting there, brush in hand, staring at a blank canvas. "Need help with that?" I asked. She smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. "Maybe," she said softly, "you could teach me." So I did. For the first time, we painted together. Months later, I was invited to an art gala in Los Angeles. They were giving out the Artist of the Year award, and somehow I was nominated. As I stood on that grand stage, lights flashing, cameras clicking, I thought about that tiny studio apartment, the cold nights, the hunger, the fear. And I thought about that dinner table years ago when my dad told me to grow up. They called my name, applause roared, I walked up, accepted the glass trophy, and when they handed me the mic, I took a deep breath. I didn't talk about fame or money. I didn't mention revenge. I said, "This is for every person who's been told their dreams are useless. For every kid who was told they're too soft, too weird, too unrealistic. I hope one day you realize that's your power." The crowd stood. People clapped, some cried, but in that sea of faces, all I could picture were two people sitting in a quiet house, watching me from afar. When I returned to Chicago, I found a letter on my desk. It was from my mother. "Samantha, you've done what I never could. You built a life from the ashes we gave you. I will never forgive myself for the things I said. But I hope someday, when you paint again, you'll remember that even the darkest colors make the brightest art. Love, Mom." I cried quietly for a long time. Then I placed the letter in a frame right next to my first painting, Unspoken Silence. It felt right, like everything had finally come full circle. A few weeks later, I took one last walk around the neighborhood. The sun was setting. The same light that once felt cold now bathed everything in gold. I looked back at the house, their house, my house, and smiled, because this wasn't revenge anymore. This was reflection. I whispered to myself, sometimes the best way to prove them wrong is to live a life so beautiful they can't look away. Then I got in my car, rolled the windows down, and drove away, not from pain, not from anger, but toward peace. When I look back now, it almost feels unreal, like my life was a series of brushstrokes that only made sense when I stepped back far enough to see the picture. The fame, the forgiveness, the peace, it all came at a cost. A year had passed since that night at the gala. My paintings were hanging in galleries from New York to Paris. Collectors called me the soul painter. They said my work had a strange calm like grief that had learned to breathe. But behind every canvas was a shadow, my mother's letter framed on the wall. Her words lived in my head. Even the darkest colors make the brightest art. Those words changed me more than any award or applause ever could. Mom's health had been declining. She didn't tell me right away. She said she didn't want to ruin my momentum. By the time I found out, it was already too late. She passed away quietly one afternoon in the same house I'd once bought out of anger. The same house she'd filled with regret and finally with love. When I arrived, the walls were covered in her paintings, small, gentle watercolors. They weren't perfect, but they were honest. I stood in front of her last painting. It was unfinished, just a sky, half blue, half gray. On the corner, she'd written, "For Samantha, you were my sunrise." That was the moment I realized revenge had turned into redemption. I organized her funeral myself. It wasn't fancy, just family, a few close friends, and the smell of lilies. Dad stood beside me, quiet, fragile, holding her favorite scarf. He didn't speak much, but when the priest finished, he whispered to me, "She was proud of you, you know." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. For the first time, I wasn't crying from pain, but from love finally understood too late. Weeks passed. Dad and I started living together again, two people trying to rebuild something that was long broken. He wasn't the same man anymore. He'd lost the sharp edge, the arrogance. Now he just liked sitting by the porch with a cup of tea, watching sunsets. One evening I asked him, "Do you regret what you did?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Every single day. But I also thank you because if I hadn't pushed you away, maybe you wouldn't have become you." That line stayed with me. Pain made me, but forgiveness shaped me. I began painting again, not for galleries, not for fame, but for her. I started a new series called Reflections. Every painting told a part of our story: childhood, rejection, reconciliation. It was raw, painful, but strangely beautiful. A few months later, the Chicago Art Museum reached out. They wanted to host a special exhibit, Reflections, the Art of Healing. I said yes. Opening night was quiet, intimate. People walked through the dim, lit halls staring at my work. Each painting had a title, but the final one, the biggest canvas, had none. It was her unfinished sky, recreated in full size, the gray blending into blue with just one word in the corner: Mom. The crowd went silent in front of it. A woman whispered, "It feels like she's still here." And in that moment, I felt her too, not as guilt, not as absence, but as peace. After the exhibit, I sold all the pieces, but not for profit. Every dollar went to a foundation for young artists, especially those who had been abandoned or disowned by their families for chasing their dreams. I called it the Reeves Foundation. During the launch, a journalist asked me, "What made you start this?" I smiled and said, "Because I know what it feels like to have everything taken away and still find the courage to create beauty from it." A few months later, Dad fell ill again. This time it was his heart. He spent weeks in the hospital, and one night, as I sat beside him, he held my hand and said, "Don't let your heart turn to stone, Samantha. Even when people hurt you, love anyway." Those were his last words. He passed away quietly, holding my hand. The next morning, I went home and sat in front of my easel. For hours, I couldn't move. Then, slowly, I began to paint, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with love. The painting that came out was something I'd never done before. It was a portrait of both of them, Mom and Dad, standing under a sunrise. I called it home. Years have passed since then. I still live in the same house, though it feels different now. It's filled with laughter, art, and light. I teach children painting every Saturday, kids who remind me of the girl I once was. Sometimes I catch myself looking out the same window I used to stare through as a teenager back when I thought no one saw me. Now I smile because I know that even when no one believes in you, you can still believe in yourself. I whisper to that younger version of me, "You made it."